Well, hello there. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author, and I've written a bunch of books, and I make YouTube videos about being an author and about writing and about all of that kind of stuff. And man, I'm having fun. Today's a great day. It is way busier than I thought it was going to be. But I'm going to make this video. It's going to be fantastic. And we're going to talk about when books suck. Mostly we're going to talk about this because I just went through this, and I find it super helpful to verbalize. This is going to happen all videos, so just get used to it. I find it super helpful to verbalize the problems I have because they don't seem as scary when I verbalize them. So I just had an instance where I was writing a book and it sucked. The book, not the process. The process was fine. I don't mind writing. The book was bad, like objectively bad. There wasn't anything wrong with it from a grammatical standpoint. I understand how to write, but there was a huge gap in it, and I didn't know and I didn't know exactly what it was. I didn't know what I was missing. I didn't know what the story needed. Like stories often have secret sauce that makes them work. And in any narrative, there's always going to be something, some sort of thread that if you pull it out, it just gets bland. And I wrote it without that thread. Normally, when I start a story, I have that thread in mind. I know what it is that's going to make it interesting, or at least I have a sneaking suspicion. And I can work at it, right? I can try to weave it through the story. I talk with my hands a lot, and I'm only realizing this now because I've changed my camera angles. Before, you only saw here and up, and you didn't know that I was actually gesturing underneath the screen, but now I'm gesturing up here. Anyway, what was I saying? I wrote a book, and it was just bad. And I sent it to my beta readers, and I think they were trying to be nice, but one of the things that I noticed is that I was getting a lot fewer comments. This is one of the reasons why I use the process I do, and maybe I'll talk about it at some point, but I have a feedback mechanism built into my system, into my process, and it has there are a bunch of red flags, right? And one of them is when I get fewer comments than normal, or when the kind of comment that I'm getting changes. And I was getting fewer comments than normal, and I started to think to myself, uh-oh, what's wrong? And the reality was that I knew that something was already wrong. I could feel it in the book. And thankfully, I have great beta readers. And one of them said, hey, this doesn't seem quite right. And when they said that, it was like an explosion went off in my mind. And all of a sudden, I was like, yeah, it's not right. I need to rewrite this whole beginning of the book. I was about a third of the way through at that point. And so that's exactly what I did. I stopped. I went back to chapter 1, and I just rewrote. And I rewrote 20 chapters, right? I never rewrite. But this book was bad. And so I had to rewrite it. That was a really long way to get to what I want to tell you, which is that there are specific ways that we can determine what's wrong with a story. And then once we determine what's wrong, we have a couple different options for how to fix it. Okay? But before we get into any of that, there's one key piece that I think is really, really important. And that is the ability to rethink our work. As creatives, our identity is often really tied up in what we make. And this is true for me and for everybody else. Anybody who writes books or makes art, we really pour ourselves into it. And so when somebody sees it and comments on it, we have an instinct to defend ourselves against criticism, sometimes even defend ourselves against praise, which is a really weird thing. In order to make sure that the information we're receiving conforms to our existing thought about what it is. So that proves to be troublesome when we're writing something that isn't good. Because if we think it is good, or if our identity is tied up in being a good writer, then if somebody says something about it, we can get really defensive. And for the first 15 chapters of this book, that's where I was. I was like, no, I'm a good writer. It can't be that bad, right? But in this case, I had just missed the mark, right? The technical, from a technical standpoint, the writing was fine. But in terms of the story, I had just missed the mark. And so it's really helpful to be able to rethink our position, rethink our the art that we've created, reassess its quality. But the really important question is, how does that trigger, right? How do we trigger that rethinking? So it really boils down to, how do we determine that something is wrong? And then how do we determine what is wrong? And there are a couple options, like I said. The first and most, the easiest, I should say, is if we have people read it and they say, this sucks. That's the easiest. And then you say, oh, I either wasn't aware of that, or I was peripherally aware of that, or I was actually aware of that, and I just needed somebody else to say it. Now, not all of us have the luxury of beta readers, and I understand that. And not all of us have the relationships with other people whose opinions we should be listening to, who will also be honest with us. It is a rare thing to find somebody who will be truly honest with you when it comes to your writing, especially if they have a relationship with you, because they don't want to hurt you or disappoint you or make you think that they don't like you. There are all sorts of like nuances to relationships that get in the way of making the best creative things. So if you don't have that option, what do you do? Well, there's an internal check that you can use, an internal flag, so to speak. If you are writing something and you find yourself becoming bored, or you find yourself not wanting to write it, or you find yourself becoming frustrated every time you write in that story, chances are there is some sort of subconscious thought process in your head that is identifying that your story sucks, that it's not good. And until you fix it, it becomes really burdensome to write. And so that's another way, if you can't get sort of outside feedback on whether or not your story is good, that's another way to be like, oh, maybe this isn't great. If you feel that internal resistance kicking up. Now, I'm not talking about the resistance that's like, I want to write today, but I'm feeling resistance, so I'm not going to write. No, this is different. This is like, I really want to write, but I don't want to write this story. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know where to go. It feels wrong, right? That's what I'm talking about. And that's an instinct that is honed over years and years of writing. That's an instinct that you develop as time goes on. And so the better you are as a writer, or the longer you've written, the more accurate your gut instinct about your own writing will be. Now, that doesn't mean you're always correct, right? Sometimes you write something and you're like, this is great. And then people read it and they're like, it's not really great. Or sometimes you're like, man, this is terrible. And then people read it and are like, this is the best thing you have ever written. That happens too. And hopefully that happens more than the other way. So once you've identified it, though, how do you fix it? How do you turn around and say, okay, something's wrong. What do I do about it? Well, first you have to identify specifically what the problem is. And the problem can be one of a couple of things. It can be a problem with the plot. The plot can just be confusing. It can be a problem with characters. Your characters might be flat or boring. Or it could be a problem with pacing. Okay? And those are the three main problems that you're going to have that aren't technical. You can also have technical problems, and a technical problem would be like your dialogue isn't tagged properly, so it's really confusing as to who's talking, or you over describe or under describe everything that's going on. But most often, the problems you're going to find are either with character, your characters aren't good, it's with plot, your plot is confusing, or it's with pacing. It's either too slow or too fast, right? And so once you identify which of those things is the problem, how do you go about fixing it? Well, you go about fixing it the same way you go about writing. You just sit down and you start to work through it. I think often we're afraid to write because we don't know what's going to come. But there's really some magic in that. You don't have to be worried that somehow you're going to exhaust your creativity. That's not how that works. The more you problem solve, the more solutions will come to mind. In fact, this is a scientifically studied phenomenon where if somebody is given a task of coming up with a couple of solutions, they can usually sit down and come up with a couple of ways to solve a problem. But if they're told to sit until they have 100 solutions, the 100th solution is almost always drastically better than the first few solutions that they give. Creativity improves the more we use it, especially in the same session. So if you're looking at your story and you're like, man, I don't even know where to start with this, what I would encourage you to do is just pick a problem and start solving it. And don't worry about whether your solution is going to be good or not. Worry about whether you're solving it. And then if you get to the end of that process and you're like, that solution's great, fantastic. If you're like, that solution isn't great, no problem. You just do it over again. This isn't a quick fix or an easy fix, but it is a fix that produces fantastic results. And that's really what we ultimately want, right? We want to write the best book possible. We want to tell the best story possible. So, if you're ever finding yourself in that situation where your internal flags or external flags are waving and are like, hey, there's a problem here, remember, it's going to be a problem most likely with your characters, with your plot, or with your pacing. And then once you know which one it is, or maybe it's all three, in my case, it was a problem with characters and with pacing. Once you know what the problem is, just start solving it. Just start writing and fix in your mind, okay, I got to fix the characters, or I've got to fix the pacing, or I've got to fix the plot, and just start working on it. And if you get to the end of it and you still don't like it, no worries, rewrite it. It doesn't matter how many times you rewrite something. It just matters that you end up with a good result. And so putting in the work to get there is what we do. Anyway, this was long and rambly, and thanks for watching if you watched it.